Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to Strength Coach Rants. I'm your host, Connor Lyons, and today we are going to talk about the SAID principle and ask why does it get absolutely ignored through 90% of training when it comes to team sports. All right, so what is the SAID principle? SAID, spelled S-A-I-D, all right, stands for Specific Adaptations to Impose Demands. Now, what does that mean? Really, it's just a fancy way of saying that we're going to adapt to the stresses that we place our body under. Now, whether that's conditioning, strength, power, speed, size, like muscle growth, hypertrophy, or even mobility, our body's going to adapt to the stresses we place under it. So the next time it sees those stressors, right, it's a little bit easier to get through them. That's why, a progressive overload, no matter what it is like the best way to kind of get better within the gym, whether that's like adding more weight, adding more reps, adding more time under tension, increasing the distance of a sprint, increasing the height of a jump, whatever it is, those small incremental like changes and growth are going to be what make us better over time. That's why we can't go from like 0 to 1,000 in the gym, even though everybody wants to get better yesterday. It takes time, and that's because we can only adapt to so much stress at a time. You got to put your body just outside what it's capable of so that we'll be ready for it the next time, and then we do it again, and then we do it again, and so on and so forth. We take those little kind of small steps to getting better. Now, what does this mean in relation to sport? Well, we'll talk about the gym a little bit later, but right now we're going to focus specifically on conditioning because when it comes to team sports, for some odd reason, all that knowledge goes straight out the window. I've seen strength and conditioning coaches at the university and professional levels doing conditioning that was in no way, shape, or form conducive to what happens on the field of play. I'll give you, for instance, when I was at USF, this was back 2009 to 2011. This was the end of the Jim Levitt area into the Skip Holtz era. And the biggest conditioning, this is probably 90% of colleges. USF wasn't alone. This is very common. Conditioning test was 16 110s. Now, within these 16 110s, your bigs, or like your big guys inside the box, they're having to finish in 20 seconds. Your big skill, right, that's some DBs, linebackers, defensive ends probably fall into that range because they're still big, but they're a little bit more skilled. They move a little bit better. Those are 18 seconds. And then your skill guys, that's everybody outside the box, your quarterbacks, your wide receivers, your corners, your safeties, guys like that. Running backs, they all have to finish in 16 seconds, right? So you've got between 16 and 20 seconds of all-out work to go 110 yards, and you're going to do that 16 times with about a 2-to-1 rest to work ratio, meaning you're working for upwards of 20 seconds, you're getting upwards of 40 seconds off, and then you're having to do it again for a total of 16 times. Now, what's weird about this is the average football play is somewhere between 4 and 7 seconds, right? That obviously there are plays that extend well longer than that, and there are plays that are dead half a second into the play, but on average it's 4 to 7 seconds. Now, this conditioning test to see if these fellas were ready to play football was 20 seconds at a time, 16 times with a 2-to-1 work to rest ratio, whereas a football play is 4 to 7 seconds at a time with upwards of 30 seconds rest of active recovery, getting to the line, going over the next play and all that. So very odd that a sport like football at the highest levels, the collegiate level, the NCAA Division I, which at the time was considered, it was the FBS. I don't know what they call it now. They've got a playoff now. But it was the FBS, so the bowl-bound teams, highest level of college football in the country, in the world, really. And they were conditioning, they were testing to ensure that guys were ready by doing conditioning tests that didn't mimic the sport in any way, shape, or form. Now, in an effort to get these guys ready for this test before the season started, what do you think their training looked like? Did it look like it was to prepare them for football, or did it look like it was to prepare them to run these 110s? If you guessed the latter, you were correct, right? So what we did was we spent the entirety of the summer conditioning these guys not to play football, but to pass a stupid test so that they could play football. And you saw it on the field of play. And this isn't isolated to being at USF. This was legit all across the country. 110s are, man, at the time, it was probably 80% of universities. That was their their conditioning test. And the reason why that was their conditioning test is because of football coaches. They had too much pull. I don't know what he's like anymore, but back when John Tortorella was the head coach of the Lightning, from what I understand, they would have to run like 4 or 5 miles as part of like their conditioning test to play hockey. And again, if you go back, I'll link in the description to the hockey conditioning video that I did. That's well longer than these athletes will ever need on the field to play. One thing I will say, these like long, slow distance trainings, what they do is they do lay a foundation for you to be able to recover faster, but that wears itself out pretty quick. We're talking about like 2-3 weeks of running 1.5 miles to 2 miles, 3 to 4 days a week, and your base is set. Now you can go other ways with it. So why we condition to get ready for tests that test our ability to be able to play the sport that we want to play, that in no way, shape, or form mimic the energy systems we need on the field to play, is absolutely beyond me. And this was 10 years ago plus, but it doesn't change the fact that it still happens. I have a MMA fighter, right? MMA and boxing are rife with this kind of attitude. I have an MMA fighter, younger, he's 17, 18, low training age, but apparently from what I understand, a pretty good fighter. He's got some movement, deficiencies that he needs cleaned up, but overall he's supposed to be a pretty legit fighter. I was asking him about his conditioning today, like what he does. And he's like, I run like 4 miles 6 days a week. And we got into it and I started asking him like, well, what do your fights look like? I don't think they call them matches, but what do your fights look like? Well, they're 2-minute rounds with 30-second rest periods. And we do 3 of them unless it's a title fight. And then it's 5 rounds. So 2 minutes of work followed by 30 seconds of rest. You do that 3 times for the the most part. Every now and then when they do get a title fight, it's 5. Like, how does running 4 miles over the course of 25 to 30 minutes with a heart rate that's probably hovering somewhere between 140 and 160, how does that prepare you to do what you have to do in the cage, right? And I asked him, I was like, what do you do in the cage? Like, how you're punching? They don't grapple or wrestle yet. They're punching and kicking. And I was like, were you punching and kicking like for 30 minutes straight? Are you like at a very moderate effort level kicking, or are you kicking and punching as hard as you can? And are you doing it like a very hard punch or a combo, like a punch and a kick, whatever the case is, over the course of 2 to 5 seconds, and then getting a little bit of active recovery? And he said, yes, that's essentially what happens. I said, well, why are you running for 25 to 30 minutes with a heart rate that's nowhere near where it gets up to when you play? And he kind of had this puzzled look on his face. He's like, I don't know. My coach just said it's good for like my recovery in between rounds. Sorry, I was about to say periods. In between rounds. And that's the thing, is like a lot of these sport coaches, especially at these young ages, these coaches have way too much pull and they just don't understand. It's either what we did when I was growing up, so this is what we're going to do now, or it's this is hard, so it's got to make them better. And they don't know that they don't know. I don't know what the answer to this question is, right? I don't know how we educate these coaches short of these governing bodies within the sport being a little bit more proactive when it comes to their certification to coach. Like, for instance, USA Hockey has like a level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 coaching. And from what I was a hockey coach in the past, I had up to my level 3, and we went over like off ice training, but absolutely nothing having to do with like work to rest ratios, how long a shift is versus how long like the effort levels are, what percentage of the time they're operating at 100%. Those kinds of things are just, they're not given to these coaches. I would imagine football is probably pretty similar. Your average high school football coach is probably a former football player who played in high school or maybe college, even a pro athlete. and working with college and pro athletes, I'll tell you, like, they don't care about the why that they're doing things in the gym, so they never questioned it. They just said, all right, well, this is what I have to do, so I'm going to do it. It was never explained to them, this is why we do it. This is the mechanisms behind like the energy production and the energy systems that you're using. That never gets explained to them. So they just say, I played football, I did this drill, you play football, you do this drill, right? And that's what it turns into. And I really wish that there was some way to like extend an olive branch to coaches, or maybe if you're listening to this or watching this, forward this to a sport coach and just have them think about the things that they're doing. Like, if if I need to get, I don't know, more conditioned, let's use hockey as an example just because it's like the wheelhouse for me. If I need to get more condition to operate 15% of the time at all-out effort with a lot of active recovery and gliding sprinkled in with some change of direction and some battle, what do I need to do, right? I don't need to be at 100% for 45 seconds. Again, that kind of thing can lay a base, but that needs to happen like at the beginning of the season or at the tail end of the off season. And then we get in more to these sprints. There's a coach right up the road here, coaches a junior hockey team. I disagree with him on a lot of things when it comes to training, but I absolutely agree with him when it comes to the fact that he's doing sprints with his athletes that last anywhere from 4 to 7 seconds, and that's their quote unquote conditioning. Like that mimics the need of the sport. Now, sprinting, for me, there's a lot of reasons why I disagree with what he's doing, but his thought process behind what he's doing is absolutely sound. They get to where they're doing, God, like a whole bunch of sprints, right, which are going to mimic having to be able to produce high levels of speed over and over and over again for that 4 to 7 seconds, which is exactly what they'll need on the field of play. So, at least his brain's in the right spot when it comes to that. But we have other coaches that do bag skates where they're skating laps. God, we had to, for every minute that every guy was laid onto the ice, we skated for 10 minutes. So one time we had 2 kids that were 3 minutes late, and we had to skate for an hour while they watched us. Old school coaching, the kids got the message after practice, after we got done getting bag skated. So that never happened again. But that was punishment, but that's a lot of what happens in hockey is these long, but moderate intensity type skates. We had to do 100 laps without stopping. That was our conditioning. 100 laps without stopping, and every time somebody stopped, we went back to 0. So you get to 99 and somebody's not moving their feet, and guess what we're doing? We are going back to 0. So 100 laps, God, man, I want to say, dude, it took us like an hour and a half to get through that. And what world does anybody need to be operating at like top speeds or top effort levels for an hour and a half? It just doesn't exist. So if you want your conditioning to mimic the sport, right, think about this said principle: specific adaptations to impose demands. If I'm a tennis player and I need to be able to go for 4 to 7 seconds, you've got your rallies that go way longer, you've got your aces that go way less. But if my wheelhouse needs to be this 4 to 7 seconds, why am I running 6 miles at the end of the day? If I'm a football player and I need to be able to go for same thing, 4 to 7, sorry, tennis is like 1 to 5 seconds. I messed up that time. In football, it's 4 to 7 seconds. Why am I running sprints that take me 20 seconds to a minute, right? A 300-yard shuttle is like another very popular one in football. And I always tell the kids that train with me, I got this from Joe DeFranco, if you're not good at 110s and you're not good at running a 300, then congrats, you're probably a good football or hockey player, because those are the wrong energy systems. Even though they're both anaerobic, there's a lot that goes on within that makes it not conducive to being better for conditioning for the sport of football and or hockey. Baseball, if you're not good at running miles, congratulations, you're probably a better baseball player. Like, baseball conditioning would be better suited running 90 feet at a time, right? Because bags are about 30 yards in between. Do you need to be conditioned to be able to run for a double or a triple? Yeah, but I mean, those maybe double. I'll say double. How often do triples happen? How often do inside the park home runs happen? You can probably get through that on adrenaline alone. So that's not something that you should be worried about. Pitching, when I was at USF working with the baseball team, the pitching coach would have the guys who weren't pitching. We had a pitching staff of like 23 guys. It was ridiculous. But they would be running miles. They ran the entirety of the campus at USF. And if you're from Tampa and you've ever been down there, you'll realize that is an enormous campus. So miles and miles and miles of running, because they have to play 9 innings in a baseball game. But within those 9 innings, it's not moderate intensity. It's high 100% effort for a second at a time, and you have to do that upwards of 100 times, right? That is very different from running miles. So sport coaches, When it comes to conditioning, right, we're going to talk about weight training next. When it comes to conditioning, we really need to take this SAID principle into account so that we can prepare these athletes to do what they have to do on the field of play and not just give them quote unquote good work or stuff that makes them. So this SAID principle doesn't just relate to conditioning, it also relates to weight training. So if I want to get bigger, there's a way that I need to train. If I want to get stronger, there's a specific way that I need to train. If I want to get faster, there's a specific way that I need to train. It even goes deeper. If I want to get faster more often, there's a specific way to train. If I want to get faster longer more often, there's a specific way to train. If I want to be stronger more often, there's a specific way that I need to train. And you can't get these adaptations just by going in the gym and throwing weights around, right? So when you're a beginner and you get in the gym, everything works. Like you can get in the agility ladders and you may squat more in a month because any training is going to be beneficial to you. You can get in and you can goblet squat and maybe you start off with like a 25 for like 10. By the end of a month and a half, 2 months, you're probably using a 50 for like 10. And it's wild that it happens so fast, but that's what happens, right? So a lot of people see this and they think, well, in the beginning, I got a lot stronger, and then that made me faster on the field, so this is all I need to do. In reality, that's not how it works. You can lay a base with those things, but once you get into like the actual like training for the sport, it has to look a lot different now. This is where like sport-specific training comes into play. Sport-specific training isn't really movements that look like your sport. What it is more so training for adaptations that you need within the sport. And I'll give you for example here. If I'm a pitcher in baseball, I need to be very powerful for about 1 second at a time, upwards of like 100 times within a 2.5, 3 hour period. I don't know how long baseball games are, but I assume, let's say 2 hours. I need to be able to be powerful over and over and over and over again. Now, the training for that is very different than the training for putting on size is, both in duration, in loads, in bar speed, in time under tension. Very, very different. But what happens is when you get, especially into these high school football programs, a lot of college football programs, man, you'd be surprised to see the ridiculous things that happen at the Division I level, Power 5 conferences, the insanity that ensues at some of these universities when it comes to their training. Put aside the fact that you've got some of these coaches are giving these kids rhabdo. Just some of the training just isn't very conducive to what they need on the field of play. So what happens is we get, coaches that are quote unquote HIT method guys. Now, not HIIT, high intensity training, which is not high intensity, which is very odd that they called it that, which is it kind of works around higher times under tension. So it's essentially doing something to failure or doing something with very high volume in an effort to increase the size of the cell. Now, this is great for the general population, but when it comes to being faster, more resilient, not so much. What it will do is it'll allow you to be a very mediocre athlete for a longer period of time because your body is going to create more like energy substrates and mitochondria and things like that in an effort to adapt to the training. But what it won't do is make you faster, more powerful, or stronger. So you have to train again, I'll say it again, in a manner that's going to be conducive to like the adaptations you need for the field of play. So if I'm a sprinter and I'm running the 100 meter, right? What do you think my training needs to look like? What's the world record in the 100 meters? It's still 9.8 something. I mean, I know Ben Johnson said it back in the 80s, and then Usain Bolt crushed it, earlier this decade or last decade. But so I don't need high times under tension. I'm not going any longer than 10 seconds, right? So I need to be able to be powerful over and over and over again with my steps, and I need to create a lot of velocity and be able to react off that. So my training needs to look like that. If I'm let's say a wrestler, right? So somebody who is on the mat constantly having to fire muscles for, an extended period of time, maybe that's when that kind of like HIT training does actually have a little bit of benefit because it's going to make you adapt to the things that you have to do on the field of play or in this case on the mat. Hockey players, same thing. They've got to be powerful over and over and over again for short bursts. Basketball, very similar. Baseball, like even less. They got to be powerful like one time or powerful for 30 yards. powerful for one throw, right? It doesn't have to be this like high volume, high time under tension stuff, but that's what it devolves to because these coaches don't really understand. And again, I'll harp on the high school training, the high school gyms. We're not talking about like private high schools. A lot of those high schools have their own strength coaches that are actually relatively knowledgeable. I'm talking about when your football coach is in the gym with you running your training and programming it and all that. It's horrendous, some of the stuff that happens, and a lot of these teams are incredibly like talented in spite of what they're doing in the gym, and that gives these coaches the understanding that that's like our training is working, when in reality they're good in spite of what's happening in the gym. If you want to be better at your sport, you need to look at the actual needs of your sport, right? And your training outside of like setting a foundation of movement skill and work capacity and like small base levels of strength, your training needs to mimic the effort levels that you'll have on the field of play. And it's one thing I really hope you take from this. And if you've got, again, like sport coaches that are in your circle, forward them this episode and have them listen to it. Have them reach out to me and we can just kind of talk about the things that they're going to need. Because it's like really needs to change. I'm seeing 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old hockey players that like their training is so out of the realm of like what's going to be beneficial to them in the long term. And that 2 weeks ago when I kind of went on that rant about conditioning, I talked about how all my athletes coming back are worse, and that shouldn't be the case. They're in the beginnings of their season. They should be in the best shape, or they should be in the beginnings of the best shape that they're going to be in for the entirety of the season. And it's not just like quote unquote gym, like what's the word I'm looking for, being in gym shape. Like they're just not in shape at all. And some of it's because they're overtrained. Some of it's because like their body's being pulled in too many different directions when it comes to adapting to the conditioning that they have to do, adapting to the strength training that they're doing, and adapting to like the effort levels on the field of play. There's just too much going on. And so your body doesn't really adapt to any of it. And we end up in this overtrained weird limbo where we're not getting better and we're definitely kind of getting a little bit worse. So, said principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. Now, this matters for your conditioning and this matters for your training, and realistically, this matters for like your on the field practices as well. Your practices should mimic game type situations. That's why small area games are just as beneficial when it comes to conditioning as sprints are. And I would say the value of small area games is even higher than that of sprinting because your athletes are going to be dialed in because it's fun. Sprinting is not fun. Playing a small area game and getting better at your sport is fun. So, say it one more time. Said principle, specific adaptations to impose demands. Your conditioning needs to mimic the demands that you need for the field. Your training in the gym needs to mimic the demands that you need on the field. Your practices need to mimic the demands that you need on the field if we're going to adapt to get better at the sport and even just better as an athlete in general. That's all I got for today. We'll shut it down here. Hope you learned something. If you have any questions, reach out to me, Connor@theldsp.com, Lions Den Sports Performance. I'll get back to you. I love to talk shop, and I'll help you with whatever you need if it's going to help make your athletes a little bit better. Thanks for tuning in this week, and we'll see you next week.